The gravel was frost-cold beneath her bare feet, and she did not feel it. That was the thing she would remember later, when the feeling returned, and the pain arrived in its place. The understanding that in the moment of carrying him, she had felt nothing at all below the ankle, only the weight of the child against her chest and the heat of the fire behind her, pressing at her back like a hand. Edmund had not cried. She had not spoken. They had moved together through the servants' passage in near total silence, one of his small woolen mittens clutched in her left hand because she had grabbed it from the hook beside his door in the first instinctive second of the alarm, and had not let go since. Her right arm held him entirely. He had pressed his face against her shoulder, and she had said nothing, only held him, only moved, only kept her body between the burning glow at the stable end of the corridor and the door at the far end that opened to the walled garden. She pressed through that door into the November dark and the frost and the smoke-sharp air, and she turned to stand against the garden wall, away from the house, away from the windows where the light was spreading. She heard the shouts beginning in the upper rooms. She did not move toward them. She was looking at the gate. The gate to the back lane was standing open, which it ought not to have been, and there was a man on horseback coming through it. And the horse was lathered from speed, and the man on the horse was looking at her. Nicholas Ashworth, Viscount Harwick, had not been expected until Thursday. He sat his horse without moving for one full moment, taking in the picture she made, the governess barefoot on the November gravel, a child in her arms, the cloak around the child and nothing around her, the fire's light catching the angles of her face, her expression entirely composed. He looked at her the way a man looks when he understands something he did not know he did not know. She did not look away. She was too cold and too steady to look away. "The child," she said, and her voice was level. "He is unharmed." He dismounted. He said nothing at all. She had come to Harwick Park in the last week of July, in the flat, heavy heat of a summer that seemed determined to be remembered, though by the time she arrived, the household had already forgotten it in favor of its own concerns. The position had been arranged through an agency in Bath. 2 weeks after her previous employment had ended, in a manner she did not fully describe in correspondence, and the agency had not pressed her to explain. A governess who came well recommended and asked for little was not the sort of woman one pressed. She had asked for very little, a room with a north-facing window because the light was better for drawing instruction, her Sundays free for correspondence, no requirement to attend household entertainments in any social capacity. These conditions had been accepted by Nicholas's steward, Mr. Peel, on behalf of a lord who was rarely at the estate and had engaged Cecily without interview, on the strength of her references and the agency's endorsement. Edmund Ashworth was 7 years old and had not spoken more than 2 consecutive words to any member of the household staff for the 4 months since his parents' deaths had deposited him at Harwick. He was the son of Robert Ashworth, the Viscount's younger brother, dead of a fever contracted in the same week as his wife. Edmund had come to the house in March with a small trunk, a painted wooden soldier, and a blankness in his face that the housekeeper had mistaken for placidity, and Cecily, on her first morning, had immediately recognized as grief. She had not tried to fill the silence. She had sat across the schoolroom table from him and opened a book about insects and begun to read aloud without expectation, and Edmund had looked up after 4 pages, which was progress. By September he had told her about the wooden soldier's name, Captain Fairweather, and she had given the captain a proper commission and a military history, and a minor but honorable wound sustained at a fictional engagement near Lisbon, and Edmund had added to this history daily. By October he had laughed, once, at a joke she made about the weather, and the sound of it had taken her entirely off guard and she had looked out the window so he would not see what the sound had done to her face. The household had its own rhythms, most of which did not include her. Lady Harwick. The Viscount's mother kept the dower house at the south end of the grounds and called twice weekly, sitting in the main drawing room with a cup of tea and a fan she held at a particular angle, measuring everything in the house against a standard only she could see. She had assessed Cecily in the first week and arrived at a conclusion that she did not think required revision. "She is competent enough," Lady Harwick had said to Mr. Peel, on an occasion when Cecily was passing in the corridor and Lady Harwick had not noticed the door was ajar. "She has a quiet manner, and Edmund does not seem distressed. She ought not to be consulted on the boy's arrangements. She is the governess, and nothing more. These women sometimes develop ideas above the position." Cecily had taken 2 more steps down the corridor and descended the servants' stair, and had gone directly to the schoolroom, where Edmund was waiting with Captain Fairweather's dispatches. She knew the shape of that verdict. She had heard it before, at the Tilbourne household in Somersetshire, where she had spent 14 months as governess to 3 children, until the day she had told Mrs. Tilbourne that her eldest son, then visiting from Oxford, had struck the youngest child with a riding crop for crying at dinner. Mrs. Tilbourne had looked at her for a long time and then had said, with a politeness that was the precise shape of a door closing, "You are the governess, Miss Morrow. You are not the arbiter of this family." She had been dismissed the following week with a reference that praised her teaching and said nothing else. The Tilbourne family had closed ranks so efficiently that there was no seam to find. She had spent 3 weeks in Bath before the agency placed her at Harwick, and in those 3 weeks she had understood with a completeness that was almost physical that speaking aloud, in this world, cost more than silence, and that she would not spend herself on words that would be disbelieved. She had come to Harwick resolved to be useful and invisible, to protect where she could protect, and to keep that protection quiet. Gerald Harwick came to the estate the 2nd week of October, unannounced and apparently unconcerned about being unannounced, which told her everything she needed to know about how he understood his position within the household. He was the Viscount's cousin on the paternal side, 38 and unmarried, with a manner that was perfectly polished and eyes that moved over a room the way a man counts silver. He inquired after the estate's accounts. He inspected the stables. He spent an afternoon in the estate office with Mr. Peel, who emerged from that conversation looking careful. Gerald paid no attention to Cecily at all on his first visit, except that she caught him, once, watching Edmund cross the lawn with Captain Fairweather in his coat pocket, and the expression on Gerald's face was one she did not know how to name, but could not put away. He came a second time in November, and this time he stayed for a week, and on the 3rd evening of that week, Lord Harwick arrived without warning from London and found his cousin at his dining table. She saw Lord Harwick first at dinner that evening, from the governess's seat at the table's far end, which was technically a seat at the table and technically below it in every way that mattered. He was taller than she had imagined from the portrait in the entrance hall, and the portrait had conveyed the jaw and the eyes, but not the quality of stillness he carried in his person, which was not the stillness of ease, but of control that had become so practiced it had grown indistinguishable from the surface of him. He did not look at her. He barely looked at Edmund, except for one moment across the soup course when Edmund knocked a spoon from the table and glanced up in anticipation of censure, and Lord Harwick's gaze moved to the boy and stopped there for exactly 3 seconds before the footman retrieved the spoon, and the moment dissolved. Gerald talked at length about the estate's drainage prospects. Lady Harwick had come from the dower house for the occasion and was in magnificent form, asking pointed questions about the London season and the relative merits of several marriageable young women from families she approved of. Cecily attended to Edmund's plate and said nothing, which was the correct thing to do. Then Gerald turned to her. He did not address her by name. He addressed the air slightly to her left and said, as if remarking on the weather, "I understand the child has been kept rather apart from the family during his time here. That seems an unusual arrangement. Whose choice is that?" The table fell quiet. She felt Lady Harwick's attention shift to her like a change in barometric pressure. "It was mine," Cecily said, and her voice was steady. Edmund had suffered losses that required a period of gentleness before the resumption of formal expectations. "I judge that correct." Gerald smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "She is the governess and nothing more," he said pleasantly, addressing Lady Harwick now, as if explaining something to the room. "I imagine she is not to be consulted on the family's arrangements. My lord, you'll want to review what instructions have been given to your household staff on the matter of Edmund's future." She did not flinch. She looked at her plate and then at Edmund, who was looking at Gerald with an expression she had never seen on his face. Calm and watching. Far older than 7 years. Lord Harwick said, "That will do, Gerald." He said nothing else. He did not look at Cecily. The dinner continued. He had heard her. The fire began at 2:30 in the morning, and she was already awake. She had been awake since 1, for no reason she could precisely name beyond a restlessness that had kept her at the north-facing window with a candle she kept shielding from the draft. She had heard it before she smelled it, a crackling at a frequency the house did not normally produce, low and spreading. She had been at Edmund's door in 40 seconds. He was asleep. She did not wake him with words. She gathered him against her, still wrapped in his blankets, and she took her cloak from the hook behind the door and put it around him rather than herself. And she took his mittens from the schoolroom hook as she passed, because her hands remembered them before her mind did, and she went down the servants' passage with her candle held low. She did not call for help. She did not shout. The last household she had served had taught her that the space between raising alarm and being believed was wider than she could cross in a crisis, and so she narrowed her ambitions. She would get the child out, and then there would be time enough for everything else. The passage smelled of smoke, but not yet thickly. She moved quickly, and without sound. Edmund stirred against her shoulder, and she said very quietly, "Hush." And he hushed. At the garden door she paused to listen. No sound from the lane. The fire's glow was visible around the far corner of the house now, orange against the gray November cloud, casting the grounds in a kind of displaced dawn. She moved along the wall to the garden door, pressed through it, felt the frost come up through the soles of her feet like cold water, and put her back against the garden wall where the stone blocked the worst of the wind. She saw the gate standing open and the horse and the man coming through it, and she held still. He came to her directly. He dismounted and handed the reins to a groom who had appeared from the stable wing and was shouting, and he walked to her across the frost-covered gravel in his traveling coat, and he stopped 3 feet from her and looked at the child. Edmund had woken fully now, and was looking up at Lord Harwick with the same steady watchfulness he had shown at dinner. "You are cold," Lord Harwick said. Not to Edmund. To her. "I am well enough," she said. He removed his coat and held it out. She looked at it for one moment. She was shivering, she realized. She had not noticed until this exact second. She took the coat. "The stables," she said. "The grooms. I do not know if they're safe." "Peel is managing it," he said. "The horses are out. Come inside, not that way." He moved to intercept her when she turned toward the main entrance. "The east wing, come." She followed him. Edmund's weight was entirely familiar in her arms by now, and she was aware of the coat around her shoulders and the cold of the gravel receding as they crossed to the east wing's side door. He opened it himself and stood aside for her, and she went in. And the warmth of the interior hit her like arriving somewhere she had not known she was going toward. He brought them to the library, which had a fire already burning from the evening, and he said, "Sit." And she sat, and Edmund slid from her arms and stood on the hearthrug, and looked at the fire with an expression that was purely contemplative. Lord Harwick had a blanket from the window seat before she had quite settled, and he put it around Edmund's shoulders with a practicality that had no performance in it, no calculation of how it might appear. Edmund looked up at him. "Captain Fairweather is in my coat," he said. "He was in my coat, and Miss Morrow carried my coat." "He is quite safe," Cecily said. Lord Harwick crouched down to Edmund's level with no particular ceremony, and said, "A good soldier keeps his captain close." He looked at Edmund for a moment, and something shifted in his face that she could not name. "Are you well?" Edmund considered this seriously. "My feet are cold," he said. "Miss Morrow's feet are colder." Lord Harwick rose and rang for the housekeeper. He did not look at Cecily again, but he crossed to the far end of the library and stood at the dark window. And she could see in the glass the faint orange glow from the stable end of the grounds. She could see, too, the line of his back, the way he held himself. The control was still there, but something underneath it had been disturbed. Something that moved through him like a slow current just beneath the surface of a frozen river. He stood there for a long time. She sat in the library with Edmund against her side, her feet wrapped in the blanket the housekeeper brought. One of Edmund's small woolen mittens still held loosely in her left hand, and she did not speak, and neither did he. The morning that followed was managed rather than resolved. The fire had taken the stable's south end, and 2 box stalls before the household and estate workers brought it under control. The horses were safe in the paddock, the grooms shaken but unhurt. The smell of the smoke reached every room in the house by dawn, a gray and particular smell, the smell of wood that had been dry and warm and was now neither. Lord Harwick spent the early hours outside with Mr. Peel, and said nothing to the household that morning beyond the instructions required to restore order. She saw him from the schoolroom window, standing at the edge of the burned section of the stable yard, while the men worked around him. He stood the way he had stood at the library window the night before, looking at something she could not see from her elevation. Once he crouched to the ground, and she watched him study the frost-covered gravel for a long moment, before he rose and said something to Mr. Peel, who wrote in his ledger. Then Lord Harwick looked up, directly at the schoolroom window, and she stepped back from the glass and went to Edmund's books. Edmund ate his breakfast that morning without speaking, but he ate all of it, which she noted as a kind of statement. Gerald appeared at breakfast looking entirely composed, expressing appropriate concern about the fire and asking several practical questions that were positioned as helpfulness and struck her, she did not know why, as inventory. He left for London that afternoon, citing pressing business. Lord Harwick did not prevent his cousin's departure. He watched Gerald's carriage roll down the drive from the study window, and Cecily, passing in the corridor with Edmund's lesson books, saw his profile against the glass and stopped without meaning to. He turned, and she moved on. The days that followed had their own quality. She would not have called it warmth, exactly. From his side, he was not a man who moved easily toward warmth. He was in residence now, and that made the house different. More occupied in a way that was less about noise than about a kind of gravity. A center of weight that redistributed the smaller weights of the household around it. He was present at Edmund's dinner on the second evening, which she had not expected. She had come to the small dining room with Edmund at the usual hour and found Lord Harwick already seated, reading a letter that he set aside when they entered. The footman had not thought to warn her. She sat at her customary position and arranged Edmund's cutlery and said nothing. And Lord Harwick said nothing. And Edmund looked between them once with the appraising clarity of a 7-year-old accustomed to adults who communicated in silences. Lord Harwick asked Edmund 2 questions about Captain Fairweather's military history. The first was about the Portuguese campaign. The second was about the captain's most significant tactical error, and Edmund answered both at considerable length, and Cecily watched Lord Harwick listen with the careful attention of a man who is genuinely surprised to find himself interested. And something behind her breastbone shifted in a way she did not examine. She kept her eyes on her plate except when she was cutting Edmund's meat, and she felt, more than once, the quality of attention from the other end of the table that she did not look up to confirm. She was aware of exactly where he was in the room without looking. She was aware of the particular quality of the silence when Edmund paused in his account, and of the way Lord Harwick's hand rested on the table rather than moving, the stillness of a man who has decided to remain rather than leave. Lady Harwick arrived at midday on the 3rd day and found Lord Harwick in the drawing-room and said, in Cecily's hearing as she crossed the entrance hall, "Nicholas, I must speak to you about the governess. She has gotten ideas. A woman in service has no business acting independently in a household crisis. She ought to have come to me." Cecily went up the stairs and did not hear his response. On the 4th evening, she was in the schoolroom late, marking Edmund's alphabet exercises, when the door opened and Lord Harwick came in. He did not announce himself. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room as if he had not been in it recently, which she suspected was accurate. The arrangement of the furniture had not been touched since before Edmund arrived. The piano was in the corner. It was a small instrument, slightly out of tune at the upper register, and she had persuaded Edmund 3 weeks ago to let her teach him where middle C was, and from that single note he had moved with an appetite she had not anticipated, picking out phrases by ear with a patience that was entirely his own. The piano had been silent before Cecily arrived. She had been told not to use it. She had used it anyway. Lord Harwick crossed to the piano and pressed 1 key. The sound lifted and fell. "Robert played," he said. His voice was at its most level. "He played rather well. I cannot recall who taught him." She said nothing. The past tense was its own statement. He stood at the piano a moment longer. His hand rested on the lid. "Robert drowned in the lake," he said. 18 months ago. I taught him to swim. When he was 8, the age Edmund is nearly now." He paused. "I taught him that the lake was safe." She set down her pen. "I was not there that afternoon," he said. "I had come in early. I was in this house, in the study, when they brought me word." He closed the piano lid. He turned from it with the exact precision of a man who does not trust himself to remain facing a thing. "Edmund has begun to play," she said quietly. "I know." He looked at her directly for the first time since the library. "I have heard him." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had spent 4 months in this house becoming invisible, and she was not invisible now, and she could not make herself wish she were. "Miss Morrow," he said, and stopped. His jaw was set. He did not finish the sentence. "Yes, my lord." He looked at the piano once more. "Thank you," he said, and the words were plain and deliberate, and cost him something she could see, but not measure. He left. She sat in the schoolroom for a long time afterward, Edmund's alphabet exercises beneath her hands, one small woolen mitten in her apron pocket, the piano in the corner. She had been in this position before, the position of a person who knew something she had not been told, and could not act upon without risking the small good she had managed to build. At the Tilbourne house, she had known, for weeks before she spoke, about the cruelty happening behind a closed door, and she had said nothing because she knew what speaking would cost. And then she had spoken anyway, because the cost of silence was higher than the cost of expulsion. She did not know yet what speaking would cost her here. She knew what silence had cost her everywhere she had ever tried to practice it. She sat with Edmund's exercises and the smell of smoke still faint in the air. And she thought about the way Lord Harwick had said her formal title at the beginning of a sentence he had not been able to finish. She thought about the quality of his voice at "thank you," which had been the voice of a man who had not said those words in a long time and had discovered, in saying them, that he wanted to. She did not allow herself to draw conclusions. She had been a governess too long for conclusions. What she did not yet know was that in the study below her, Lord Harwick had already written 2 letters, one to his London solicitor and one to the magistrate, Mr. Fortescue. Gerald returned to Harwick Park on a Tuesday in a hired carriage, and he did not look composed. He arrived as the household was assembled in the drawing-room following luncheon, Lady Harwick at the chair nearest the fire, Mr. Peel in the corner with the estate ledgers, Cecily at the window with a book she was not reading, Edmund on the floor with Captain Fairweather and a campaign map they had drawn together on brown paper. Lord Harwick was standing at the mantelpiece in a posture she had learned to read as controlled waiting. Gerald did not greet anyone. He went to the small table near the window and produced a folded paper and held it out toward Lord Harwick. "This," he said, "was found by my man in the village. It is a statement from Tom Birch." He said the name with a deliberateness that she felt as physical, though she did not yet know the name. Birch was engaged here as an occasional groom. In this statement he says that on the night of the fire, he observed the governess at the stable door. He turned to Cecily. "You unlocked the stable door, Miss Morrow, did you not?" It was not a question. She had unlocked the stable door. She had gone to it to verify the groom's quarters were not trapped. She had found it locked and had her key from Mr. Peel's secondary set and had unlocked it. Looked in. Found it empty of persons and had locked it again before going back to the garden. She had not told anyone this because no one had asked. "I did," she said. Gerald spread his hands. "Nicholas, the matter is plain. The woman entered the stable yard before the fire. She claims she was protecting the boy, but what she did was unlock the door and depart. Someone set that fire from inside the stable." The room was silent. Lady Harwick said, with a precision that carried its own kind of gravity, "She is the governess and nothing more, Gerald. Nicholas, she must be dismissed before the magistrate is involved. For the boy's sake. Whatever she has done or not done, she should not remain in this house." Edmund looked up from the floor. Cecily looked at Lord Harwick. He stood at the mantelpiece, and he did not speak, and his face was entirely closed. And for one long, terrible second, she thought he believed it. He has weighed a cousin against a governess, and found the weight of it familiar. She reached into her pocket, and her hand found the woolen mitten. She closed her fingers around it once. The wool was warm from her body, the knit loose in one spot near the thumb where Edmund had pulled at it absently while they read together. A small imperfection she had noticed and never repaired, because to repair it would have required removing it from her pocket, and she had not done that. She thought of Edmund on the floor with Captain Fairweather. She thought of his face the morning after the fire, the way he had eaten everything on his plate without speaking, a statement of small, determined composure that was entirely his own. She thought of the piano in the corner of the schoolroom, and the sound of Lord Harwick's single pressed key, and the way the note had hung in the air between them. She thought of speaking the truth at the Tilbourne house, of how the room had rearranged itself around her words, and how the rearrangement had cost her everything. "I see," she said. She looked at Lady Harwick, then at Gerald. "Then I will pack my things." Lord Harwick said, "No." It was not loud. It was the voice he had used the night of the fire, when he had said, "Come inside." Final and without ceremony. "No one is dismissed," he said, "until Mr. Fortescue has spoken." Gerald's composure shifted. The magistrate was not sent for. "Arrives within the hour," Lord Harwick said. "I wrote to him last week." The silence that followed this was a different kind of silence from any that had preceded it. Gerald went very still. Lady Harwick turned her fan over once in her hands. Mr. Fortescue arrived in 40 minutes. He was a compact man with a ledger under his arm and a manner that suggested he had arrived at scenes of this kind before and had never found them surprising. He sat in the chair by the window that Cecily vacated and opened the ledger and said, without preamble, "Mr. Thomas Birch presented himself to my office this morning and corrected his previous statement. He states that he gave his first statement under financial inducement and that it was false. He states further that on the night in question, he had observed Gerald at the stable door, not the governess." Gerald said, "That is a lie." "He has provided corroboration," Mr. Fortescue said. He did not look up from his ledger. A second groom, also induced, recanted his own silence this morning for the same reason. Furthermore, materials consistent with incendiary use were found in the belongings deposited in the East Wing guest room during Mr. Harwick's visit. Mr. Peel identified them. I have his written account. He closed the ledger. "Mr. Gerald Harwick," he said, and now he did look up. "I am here to ask you to accompany me to Exeter." The room held its breath. Gerald looked at Lord Harwick. Lord Harwick looked back at him with a steadiness that had no fury in it and no victory, only the unblinking gravity of a man who has seen something clearly and acted on it, and is willing to be seen doing so. Gerald sat down. Lady Harwick had not moved. Her fan was at rest on her knee. She was looking at Cecily, and for the first time since Cecily had arrived at Harwick, Lady Harwick's face held something other than calibrated judgment. It held recognition. She looked away. Lord Harwick moved from the mantelpiece. He crossed to the center of the room, and he looked at Cecily, and he said, quietly, and without looking at anyone else, "She is not the governess. She is the woman I intend to marry." There was no speech after it. There was no speech before it. He had built the silence with his body, crossing the room as he had crossed the frost-covered gravel toward her, with a certainty that did not require confirmation. Edmund, on the floor, looked up from Captain Fairweather and looked at Cecily with an expression she had never seen on his face. Relief, simple and complete, as if a question he had been holding for a long time had finally been answered. Lady Harwick said nothing. Her fan remained on her knee. Mr. Fortescue cleared his throat, consulted his ledger, and said with professional composure, "I shall require Mr. Harwick to accompany me now, if you please." Gerald was escorted from the room by the two men who had come with Mr. Fortescue. He did not look at Lord Harwick again. He did not look at Cecily. The door closed. Lord Harwick stood in the center of the room. He was not looking at his mother. He was not looking at Mr. Peel. He was looking at Cecily with a directness she had not seen in him before, the control still present, but no longer performing anything, just there, a quality of his person rather than a shield. "You were going to pack your things," he said. "I thought you believed him," she said. It was the first time she had said a thing to him that was entirely undefended, and she felt it as she said it, the peculiar exposure of honesty. "I know what I saw," he said, "the night of the fire." Lady Harwick rose from her chair, slowly and with precision. She gathered her fan and her gloves. She crossed to the door without speaking. At the threshold she paused, and she looked at Cecily. And Cecily thought for a moment she would speak. But she only gave the smallest inclination of her head, a movement too small to be called acknowledgement, and too deliberate to be anything else. The door closed again. The room was quiet. Edmund had stood up from the floor. He still had Captain Fairweather in his hand. He walked across the carpet to Cecily and held out his other hand, which was empty. And when she looked at him, he said, with a gravity that was entirely his, "Your hands will be cold without the mitten." She laughed. It surprised her, the completeness of it. Lord Harwick, across the room, did not laugh. He looked at her with something in his expression that was not quite amusement, and not quite tenderness, and was recognizably, undeniably, a first fragile instance of both. That evening, the first snow of the season came down past the library windows, soft and without wind, settling on the frost-cold gravel and the walled garden and the paddock where the horses stood in their temporary shelter. The stables would be rebuilt. Mr. Peel had already drawn up the estimate. Edmund was asleep in his room with Captain Fairweather on the pillow beside him. 4 volumes of military history stacked at the bedside, because Cecily had begun reading to him from a proper account of the Portuguese campaign, which she was editing for a 7-year-old audience on the fly. The library was warm. She had been asked to come down for no stated reason, which was a form of asking that she was beginning to understand. He was at the window when she arrived, his back to the room. And he turned when she came in, and did not say anything for a moment. Only looked at her with the settled attention of a man who has decided something, and is at ease with having decided it. "I should have said something sooner," he said. "In the drawing room, when Gerald made his accusation." "You were managing the sequence," she said. "I was." He paused. "I should also have said something sooner than that." She understood him to mean something larger, and did not look away. He crossed to the fireplace, and she moved toward the window he had left. And they stood at an angle to each other in the warm room, neither of them quite at the fire, and neither of them at the window, the snow continuing its quiet work outside. "Cecily," he said, her given name in his voice at the beginning of a sentence, landing as a thing placed with care. "Yes," she said. "I am not skilled at this," he said. "I have been less skilled at everything worth having since Robert died, because I understood his death as the consequence of my confidence. I thought I knew the lake. I thought I knew what was safe." She said, "You did not set the fire." He looked at her. "You are not the cause of what burns," she said carefully, "simply because you taught someone to stand near the flame." The fire in the hearth settled. The snow went on falling past the window, unhurried and thorough. He came to her across the room, not quickly, and he stood close enough that she could see the exact gray of his eyes and the line of his jaw, and the place where the control lived, and where, at the edges of it, something warmer had begun to exist. He raised one hand and held it near her face, not touching, and she felt the warmth of it at her cheek, like a held question. "You did not lock that door to set a fire," he said. "You went to make certain there was no one trapped." "Yes," she said. "You have been doing that since July," he said. "Going quietly to make certain no one is trapped, without asking to be seen doing it." Her chest was full of something she did not have a word for. The mitten was in her apron pocket, because it was always in her apron pocket now, had been since the night of the fire. A small weight she had stopped noticing the way one stops noticing one's own pulse. "I was seen?" she said. "Yes," he said. "You were." His hand moved to her face, and his thumb was warm at the line of her jaw. and she turned toward that warmth as naturally as turning toward a window, and neither of them said anything more for a long moment. The snow fell. The fire burned. The household settled into its evening quiet around them, and the library held its warmth. In the spring, when the new stables were finished and the grounds had come back to themselves, and the season in the county had resumed its ordinary machinery, Edmund presented Cecily with his pair of small woolen mittens, both of them together, clean and slightly moth-eaten, and held out with both hands. She took them. She looked at him. "You will need them both now," he said, with the same 7-year-old gravity that she had learned to trust as entirely sincere. "You are not the governess any longer." She folded the mittens in her hands and looked out the morning-room window at the grounds, at the new stable's clean stone and the walled garden's first green, and the lane where, on a November night, a gate had stood open that ought not to have been. Nicholas was crossing the lawn toward the house, coming up from the east field with Mr. Peel, and a direction in his stride that she had come to know as simply his own. He looked up and saw her at the window. He did not wave. He was not a man who waved. He held her gaze for one moment across the distance of the grounds, and she held his. And the morning between them was clear and cold, and full of the ordinary light. Edmund tucked his hand into hers. She held it, and the mittens with it, and stood at the window until Nicholas reached the house, and the door opened below, and she heard his step on the entrance hall's stone floor. She was not the governess. She was not invisible. The house held her name now, said in a voice that knew what it was naming. That was enough. That was more than enough. If you stayed until the end, leave a thought in the comments. It is a quiet story, and quiet stories want quiet witnesses.